Welcome to Serial Stories, the podcast where we unravel the most chilling, fascinating, and downright unbelievable true crime tales. Each episode, we explore a theme that ties together the darkest corners of human history, where lives intersect with violence, intrigue, and the unthinkable. Join us as we step into a world where truth is stranger than fiction, and every tale leaves you wondering what drives someone to cross the line into the unimaginable. Sword-slinging slashers. Samurai wannabe murder. In 2004, the peaceful suburbs of Albuquerque, New Mexico became the unlikely setting for a modern-day samurai tragedy. Isaac Martinez, an easygoing neighbor with a friendly smile, had no idea that his neighbor's fascination with Japanese warrior culture would soon turn deadly. The story begins with Patrick Dunham, a young man in his mid-20s, who was known throughout the neighborhood for his unusual hobbies. Patrick wasn't interested in sports, video games, or the typical pastimes of his peers. Instead, he had one obsession: samurai culture. Patrick idolized the samurai way of life. He collected books on Bushido, practiced sword techniques in his backyard, and spoke of the discipline, the honor, and the power that the ancient warriors embodied. To some, his fascination was quirky. To others, it was a red flag. Patrick spent hours each day practicing his moves, imagining himself as a warrior, ready to face any challenge. But what started as an innocent obsession slowly transformed into something far more dangerous. Patrick began to feel that his suburban life was meaningless, that the people around him were weak, and that he was destined for something greater. Isaac Martinez was Patrick's neighbor, a kind-hearted man in his 30s. Isaac was the kind of neighbor everybody appreciated. He would wave hello, help with yard work, and always had a smile for anyone passing by. He knew Patrick was a little different, but he never imagined the difference would be dangerous. Their interactions were usually brief, an exchange of pleasantries over the fence. But on the evening of June 14th, everything changed. Isaac was in his driveway, working on his car when Patrick approached, katana in hand. At first, Isaac thought it was just another one of Patrick's practice sessions. Patrick started talking about the samurai code, about honor and respect. Isaac, confused, tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just another one of Patrick's rants. But Patrick's demeanor grew increasingly aggressive. He accused Isaac of being disrespectful, of mocking his dedication to the samurai way. What happened next was sudden and brutal. Patrick, in a delusional fit of rage, raised the katana and swung. The first strike caught Isaac off guard, cutting deep into his arm as he tried to defend himself. Isaac stumbled back, shouting for help, but Patrick was relentless. The attack was fueled by Patrick's twisted sense of purpose. He believed he was enacting some kind of samurai justice. In his mind, this was his moment of glory, his chance to prove himself as a warrior. To everyone else, it was a senseless and horrifying act of violence. Neighbors heard the commotion and called the police, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Isaac lay lifeless in the driveway, and Patrick stood over him, the katana still in his hand. His face a mix of rage and confusion. Patrick was arrested without incident. As the police led him away, he spoke of honor, of righteousness, and of being a true warrior. It was clear to everyone that Patrick's obsession had crossed a line, from fantasy into delusion, and from delusion into murder. During his trial, Patrick's defense team argued that he was mentally ill, and that his obsession with samurai culture had warped his sense of reality. They claimed he didn't understand what he was doing, and that he believed he was living out some kind of ancient code. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. Patrick was a young man who had allowed his fascination with violence to turn into a dangerous delusion, ultimately taking the life of an innocent man. Patrick was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge described the crime as tragic, an example of how obsession, left unchecked, could lead to devastating consequences. The murder of Isaac Martinez left the community in shock. How could something so brutal happen in such a quiet neighborhood? How could a young man's fascination with ancient culture lead to such senseless violence? The Cult Leader's Blade. In 2011, a small, secluded community in rural Oregon was shocked by a gruesome and bizarre murder. At the center of it was James Sage Carmichael, a self-proclaimed spiritual leader whose teachings took a dark and deadly turn. Carmichael's cult, known as the Circle of Cleansing, had long operated under the radar, its members devoted to his promise of enlightenment and spiritual purity. But those promises came at a terrible price. James Carmichael was a charismatic figure, able to draw people in with his charm and the promise of a better life. He spoke of cleansing the soul, of shedding the corruption of the modern world, and of finding true purity through his guidance. His followers, many of whom were vulnerable and searching for meaning, believed every word. They moved to the remote compound, cut ties with their family, and devoted themselves entirely to Carmichael's teachings. The Circle of Cleansing was known for its strict rituals, which became more intense over time. Followers were subjected to harsh fasting, isolation, and grueling physical tasks. Carmichael insisted that these rituals were necessary to purify the spirit, but as the rituals grew more extreme, so did Carmichael's demands. In the spring of 2011, Carmichael announced a new ritual, a ritual of ultimate cleansing. He claimed that one among them was harboring a dark spirit, a presence that threatened the purity of the entire group. The only way to cleanse this darkness, he said, was through a ritual sacrifice. The target of this so-called cleansing was a young woman named Emily, who had joined the cult just a year earlier. Emily had been struggling with doubts about Carmichael's teachings, and it seemed her hesitation had made her a target. On the night of the ritual, Carmichael gathered his followers in a circle under the moonlit sky. He wielded a katana, a weapon he claimed was sacred and had the power to banish evil. The followers, conditioned to obey without question, watched in silence as Carmichael performed the ritual. He spoke of ridding Emily of her darkness, of freeing her spirit from corruption, and then without hesitation, he used the katana to take her life. The scene was brutal and horrifying. Emily's death was not quick, and the followers were left in shock, some of them horrified but too afraid to speak out. Carmichael, covered in blood, declared that the ritual was a success, that Emily's sacrifice had cleansed the group, but the spell of his charisma was beginning to break. One of the followers, unable to bear the horror of what had happened, fled the compound the next day and went to authorities. Police raided the compound, arresting Carmichael and rescuing the remaining followers. The investigation revealed the extent of Carmichael's manipulation and the abusive practices within the cult. James Carmichael was charged with first-degree murder and multiple counts of abuse. During the trial, former followers testified about the psychological control he had over them, the isolation, the fear, and the way that he had twisted their search for meaning into something deadly. Carmichael showed no remorse, insisting that he had only done what was necessary for the group's spiritual well-being. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story of the Circle of Cleansing became a grim reminder of how easily people can be manipulated by those who prey on their vulnerabilities, and how the promise of spiritual purity can be twisted into an excuse for violence and control. Carla and her katana. In 2018, a quiet London neighborhood was shaken by a shocking act of violence. At the center of this tragedy was Darren Webster, a man whose troubled past with his ex-wife would come back to haunt him in the most brutal way. Darren and Carla Webster had been divorced 2 years prior, after a tumultuous marriage filled with arguments and accusations. Though they had gone their separate ways, the resentment between them continued to fester, especially for Carla. Carla Webster was struggling to move on from the divorce. She had lost custody of their 2 children, and her financial situation had grown increasingly desperate. She blamed Darren for everything that had gone wrong in her life, and over time her anger turned into an obsession. She began to fixate on getting revenge, convinced that Darren had destroyed her life and that she needed to make him pay. In early 2018, Carla purchased a katana from an online retailer. She had no experience with weapons, but she was drawn to the symbolism of the sword. It represented power, control, and the ability to take back what she felt she had lost. She spent weeks planning her attack, watching Darren's routine and waiting for the right moment. On a cold March evening, Carla decided it was time. She drove to Darren's flat, the katana hidden beneath her coat. She knew that he would be home alone. When Darren opened the door, he was taken by surprise. Carla forced her way inside, her rage boiling over as she confronted him. The argument escalated quickly, with Carla shouting accusations and Darren trying to calm her down. But Carla was beyond reasoning. She drew the katana and, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, began to attack. Darren tried to defend himself, but he was unarmed and caught off guard. The katana, with its razor-sharp blade, cut deep, and Darren had no chance of escape. The attack was brutal and relentless, fueled by years of pent-up anger and resentment. By the time it was over, Darren lay dead on the floor of his flat. Carla, covered in blood and trembling, seemed to come back to reality. She realized what she had done and fled the scene, but it wasn't long before police caught up with her. Neighbors had heard the commotion and called authorities, and Carla was arrested just a few blocks away, still clutching the blood-stained katana. During her trial, Carla's defense team argued that she had suffered a mental breakdown, and the years of emotional turmoil and the loss of her children had pushed her over the edge. They claimed that she hadn't planned to kill Darren, and that she had simply wanted to confront him, and things spiraled out of control. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, one of premeditation, of a woman who had allowed her anger to consume her until she was willing to commit murder. Carla was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The judge spoke of the tragedy of the situation, 2 lives destroyed by the hatred and failure to move on. The story of Darren and Carla Webster serves as a grim reminder of how unchecked anger and resentment can lead to devastating consequences, and how the desire for revenge can ultimately destroy the very person seeking it. Heist katana killing. In 2007, a convenience store in Tokyo became the scene of a shocking and bizarre crime that left the entire city on edge. It wasn't the typical armed robbery that one might expect in a bustling urban area. Instead, it was a heist that went horribly wrong when one of the assailants chose an unusual and impractical weapon: a katana. The story begins with 2 young men, Hiroshi and Kenji, both struggling with dead-end jobs and mounting debts. They had grown frustrated with their lives and began to fantasize about a way out. Eventually, their desperation led them to plan a robbery. They figured a convenience store would be an easy target, quick cash with minimal resistance, but they were wrong. Hiroshi, in particular, had a fascination with traditional Japanese culture. He owned a katana, an heirloom passed down through his family, and he insisted on bringing it along for the robbery. Despite Kenji's hesitation, Hiroshi was convinced that the sword would give them an edge, that it would intimidate anyone they encountered. In reality, it was a choice born of fantasy rather than practicality. On the night of the robbery, the 2 men entered the convenience store, their faces covered with masks. Kenji carried a small knife, while Hiroshi brandished the katana. The cashier, a young man named Yuki Tanaka, was startled but tried to remain calm as he opened the register. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until Hiroshi, in his nervousness, made a sudden and fatal mistake. Yuki moved slightly, perhaps to get a better look at the robbers or to press a hidden alarm. In a panic, Hiroshi swung the katana. The blade, sharp and unforgiving, struck Yuki, leaving him mortally wounded. The store, once filled with the mundane sounds of the quiet night shift, was now filled with chaos. Yuki collapsing to the floor, Kenji shouting in shock, and Hiroshi frozen, realizing what he had done. The 2 men fled the scene, leaving Yuki to die on the cold tile floor. They had intended to make a quick getaway with cash, but instead they found themselves on the run for murder. The katana, once a symbol of heritage and history, had become the instrument of a senseless killing. It did not take long for police to track them down. The entire city was outraged by the brutality of the crime, and surveillance footage quickly led to their identification. Both Hiroshi and Kenji were arrested within days of the robbery, hiding out in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of Tokyo. During the trial, Hiroshi's defense team argued that the killing had not been intentional, that it was a tragic accident born out of panic. They claimed that Hiroshi had brought the katana to intimidate, not to kill. But the prosecution emphasized the recklessness of their actions, how bringing such a deadly weapon into a volatile situation had made violence almost inevitable. Hiroshi was found guilty of manslaughter, while Kenji was convicted as an accomplice. Hiroshi received a lengthy prison sentence, while Kenji, though given a lighter sentence, still faced years behind bars. The convenience store killing became a symbol of misplaced bravado and the tragic consequences of desperation. The Ishikawa Clan Massacre. In 1986, Kyoto, Japan witnessed a violent eruption of a long-standing family feud that ended in bloodshed. The Ishikawa family, a once prominent clan, had been divided for decades by a bitter dispute over inheritance, honor, and deep-rooted grudges. It was at a family gathering that these tensions finally boiled over, resulting in what would be remembered as the Ishikawa clan incident, a massacre carried out with a weapon meant to symbolize the family heritage. The Ishikawa family was large, with multiple branches that had grown increasingly estranged over the years. The feud had begun decades earlier, when the family patriarch died, leaving behind an inheritance that many felt had been unfairly distributed. The resulting disputes had split the family, with some members refusing to speak to each other for years. But in 1986, an attempt was made to reconcile. A family meeting was organized, bringing together various branches in the hopes of finally putting the past behind them. The gathering took place at the ancestral home, a traditional, sprawling estate on the outskirts of Kyoto. The house was filled with memories of the family's proud history, and at the center of it all was the family katana, a ceremonial sword passed down through the generations. It was meant to represent the family's honor, a symbol of unity and tradition. But that day, it would become a weapon of destruction. As the meeting began, old grievances quickly resurfaced, arguments broke out, accusations hurled, and the air grew thick with tension. The family members, already on edge, found themselves unable to move past the bitterness that had festered for so long. One man in particular, Hiroto Ishikawa, had been harboring a deep resentment toward his cousin, whom he blamed for his side of the family being cut off from the rightful inheritance. Hiroto, a man known for his quick temper, had reached his breaking point. In a fit of rage, he stormed out of the room and returned moments later with the family katana. Without hesitation, Hiroto began to attack. The scene was chaotic and brutal. Family members screamed and scrambled to escape as Hiroto lashed out, his fury unchecked. He struck down two of his cousins before others managed to overpower him, wresting the katana from his hands. By the time police arrived, the ancestral home was a scene of devastation. 2 family members dead, several others injured, and the once proud symbol of the Ishikawa clan stained with blood. Hiroto was arrested at the scene, his face a mix of anger and despair. During his trial, he showed little remorse, insisting that he had been driven to his actions by years of mistreatment and disrespect. He claimed that the family katana had always been a symbol of power, and that he had simply used it to reclaim what was rightfully his. The court, however, saw it differently. Hiroto was found guilty of double homicide and sentenced to life in prison. The incident left the surviving family members even more divided, the hope for reconciliation lost in the wake of the bloodshed and betrayal.